Welcome everyone to Friday Fellowship with CCF. So glad for all of you who are here, watching live or watching this recorded. I also just want to welcome everybody who's here for the first time. If you're not part of CCF normally, we're really glad to have you with us. Today is Good Friday, a very important day in the Christian calendar. And I've been thinking a lot about it today, particularly its significance in the time that we're living through right now. I grew up in white evangelicalism, where there's a tendency always to jump straight to Easter Sunday to think about the victory of the cross and salvation and the good news, and not to want to dwell in the space that is Good Friday. But it feels very relevant right now with everything that's going on, with the anti-Asian violence and hatred that we've seen recently in the last few weeks, and I know has been very much on the minds of some of us. A lot of people in our country right now are living in fear or with a lot of anger, rightfully so. And also with the Derek Chauvin trial right now in the death of George Floyd, and how we are continuously reminded of the violence and the oppressive violence within our society. And so thinking about Good Friday and just what it means today, the very idea that God, in the space of being a human, would allow God's self to experience violence, violence at the hand of the state, a state that the Roman government determined to break and kill and humiliate anybody who would challenge its power. That's what Good Friday is. There's many theological ways of understanding Good Friday, many important things we could say about it. But how important right now just to think about the idea that God knows violence because God has experienced violence, and that God identifies with us in these places of oppression and violence and experiencing them, because that is the position and the posture that God took in Jesus Christ. As we move into a time of reflecting and making a little space to be here tonight, we're going to put up a slide with some music, and I want to invite us just to take a moment and enter in to meet God, to center ourselves, to reflect whatever it is that you want to do, but to be in a Good Friday space together. Thank you.
Hello everyone, welcome to CCF Friday Fellowship. My name is Paris Prem. I'm a current junior at Pitzer. I use she, her pronouns, and so happy that you joined us for Friday Fellowship. It's going to be another great talk this evening, and I'm looking forward to it. And of course, I have a few announcements. Y'all know the vibes. You know the vibes. We have a Zoom hangout after our talk today. We'll be able to find the link in all the usual places on CCS Facebook page and our Facebook Messenger chat and Lorraine's weekly emails. You know, word around town is that we might be doing an escape room. So, you know, come afterwards and find out. And you know the vibes again. It's workout with Matt. You know, funny thing is I still have not been, and my body has been like, yes, like you really, really need to work out. Like, you know, all the hours sitting on Zoom is not doing your body well. Why don't you go work out with Matt? But you know, me, I might procrastinate, but you should go. You should join Matt and the workout at 10 a.m. Tomorrow. Same thing. Find the link. It's CCS Facebook. And yeah. And I'm definitely looking forward to next week as we begin a new talk series on spiritual practices, and our dear favorite Lorraine will be speaking on therapy as a sacred activity. I'm definitely looking forward to that talk, and Lord knows that I need some therapy. You know what I'm saying? Just kidding. But I don't know, maybe not. But anyways, I'm gonna turn it over to Lorraine now as she introduces Don Abrams.
Thanks, Paris. You're hilarious. Just a note about my talk next week. We're going to host it in our private Facebook group. I will be speaking, but we'll also be hearing some testimonies from students and alumni about how God has worked through therapy in their lives. And so we just want to keep it kind of more private. So we'll send out a link for that, but hope you can join us. So tonight we are privileged to have Don Abram as our speaker as we close out our series, Reconstructing Christian Ethics. Don spoke for us last semester as well, and we're so excited to have him back. After he graduated from Pomona in 2016, he attended Harvard Divinity School, where he earned a Master of Divinity. Recently, he has worked as an organizer with the Jamie Harrison for Senate campaign and as a qualitative researcher with Stanford University. Currently, he is a program manager at Interfaith Youth Corps. He is also the founder of Pride in the Pews, a grassroots nationwide campaign celebrating queer voices in the Black church. So we are so happy to have you, Don. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Lorraine. So appreciate that introduction. It is an unadulterated privilege and an honor to be with the Claremont Christian Fellowship. I am always humbled by the opportunity to stand behind the virtual sacred desk one more time. Before I begin, I'd like to just honor all of those who've spoken throughout this entire series. I've been able to tune in, and I've just been blessed by the words that so many folks have spoken before me. So I just wanted to honor that and thank them for the messages, which were informative and provocative and undoubtedly timely. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and pray. I'll read scripture and then we can just jump right in. So eternal and gracious God, we thank you for life. You say in your word that it is in you that we live, move, and have our being. I pray in this preaching moment that the people would see all of you and none of me. I pray that you would use these lips of clay to bring your message forward. Now, God, as I dive into the depths of your word, I pray that you would be glorified and that your people will be edified. It is in the mighty, matchless, and miraculous name of Jesus I do pray. Amen. So as you all know, this actually is the inverse. Normally the preacher introduces this text and then he gives you the title. You all know the title, and that is Undoing the Christian Love Affair with Hierarchy and Power. So the scripture that really came to mind and that resonated with me as I thought about how we might think about undoing the Christian love affair with hierarchy and power is Matthew chapter 21, verses 12 through 13. That's Matthew chapter 21, verses 12 through 13. And it reads thusly: Jesus entered the temple courts and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. It is written, he said to them, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers. That's the text I'll be preaching from today. Again, that's Matthew chapter 21, verses 12 through 13, if you are in fact interested in pulling it up on your own. Answer me this: how do you live in a world that does not want you to exist? How do you celebrate the totality of your humanity when others refuse to see you as fully human, as someone worthy of care, compassion, and community? It's one thing to be ignored in a cisgendered, straight, white world. It's another to be rendered invisible, with no acknowledgement of your pain or your persecution. As I see it, this is the plight of all who have been othered in America today. It is the reality of Asian Americans being callously and viciously targeted by the embodiments of white supremacist ideologies. It is a fact of life for Black trans women dying at historic and astronomical rates. It is the cold, hard truth of children being locked in cages that our tax-paying dollars are being used to fund. Our, and yes, I say our humanity, the humanity of the other, is up for tireless negotiation. Our, yes, our identities are perpetually mocked and mishandled. And even worse, we are forced to suffer daily indignities that strip us of basic respect and common decency. Communities called to love us, the othered, unconditionally have chosen to only love parts of us, the parts of us that they understand, that they can relate to, that they deem as palatable. Instead of loving us wholly, these communities choose to love us in pieces, often ignoring the pieces of us that complete our understanding of self. So where does that leave us, the othered, in America? A people whose rights are precarious, whose blood is spilled, whose blood is spilled with impunity, whose lives are seen as disposable. The incomparable and esteemed literary genius James Baldwin posits that it may leave us enraged. The prophetic and prolific Baldwin argued, and I'm paraphrasing here, to be othered in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a state of rage almost all the time. Rage, in the way that Baldwin understood it, is a natural response to ongoing and overt dehumanization. When the basic rights afforded to those born with the white, right, shade of skin, when the basic rights afforded to those born with the white, right look, are stripped from those of us who have been othered, James Baldwin argues that that is enough to leave us enraged. Rage born out of injustice is often connoted as an unproductive emotion and even as an unchristian emotion. It's branded as a tool by those who with limited insight and minimal intellect. Rage, as it is popularly understood, especially when embodied by the other, is detached from reason and divorced from legitimate cause. It's seen by those in power as an overreaction, as an unnecessary disruption to the status quo, as an uncultured, uncivilized expression of self. For all intents and purposes, it's deemed as being ineffectual, futile, and all but constructive. This dominant and, might I add, dubious framing of rage conveniently serves those in power while silencing those on the underside of power. For those of you who might need to be convinced, let me see if I can provide two salient and contemporary examples. When Colin Kaepernick, the NFL quarterback who is still out of a job, chose to kneel to bring attention to police brutality, those in power claimed that he was disrespecting the flag. But when Trump supporting insurrectionists descended on the Capitol with the intention of overthrowing our government, they were simply branded as misguided patriots. Maybe that doesn't do it for you. Maybe I can lift up another example. When Native Americans, the folks who were here before anyone else, protest the use of their sacred symbols and culture in sports and on merchandise, those in power claim they are being overly sensitive. But those who are protecting the statues of slave owners and Confederate generals, they are good old Americans protecting a good old American legacy. Are you noticing a trend? If rage is embodied by those in power, it's justified. If it's embodied by those who they would deem as the perceived other, it is illegitimate. This myopic framing utterly strips those on the margins of the one tool they are unilaterally entitled to: righteous rage. Now, some listening might view the phrase righteous rage as an oxymoron. Some might even suggest that it is blasphemous or even inherently heretical. But I might suggest to you that in this season of American history, in this tumultuous and turbulent time, righteous rage is not only warranted, but it is biblically mandated. If we are to undo Christianity's love affair with hierarchy and power, perhaps we should start with the cultivation of righteous rage. I know the prospect of embodying righteous rage goes against all that we understand about the pacifist, Eurocentric white Jesus used to sanction violence and oppression. You're right. But it accords well with the brown Jesus who centered the oppressed, the brown Jesus who centered the marginalized, the brown Jesus, the radical Jesus who centered the least of these. It does, however, align with the Jesus who stood for justice and stood up for the poor. That Jesus, I submit to you, encouraged and even demonstrated the embodiment of righteous rage. Now, before I am met with a deluge of shock and awe, come and go with me to the 21st chapter of Matthew. It is here you will discover a Jesus who did away with respectability politics. It is here where you will find a Jesus who defied conventional Greco-Roman notions of civility. A Jesus who chose people over profit. A Jesus who chose protest over the status quo. In the 21st chapter of Matthew, the writer of the text states that Jesus entered the temple courts, driving out all of those who were buying and selling. Jesus became so indignant, catch this, that he destroyed property by turning over tables and benches. Now, if we are to truly appreciate the power of Jesus's protest, we must first understand the context in which we find Jesus the Christ. In the age of Jesus, the temple occupied a dual role. It operated as both a sacred and a secular place. I hope you don't mind if I teach it before I preach it. The temple, as many believed, was described as, in Jesus's time, the center of the world. While not obviously the geographical center of the world, it was at the heart of Jewish religious identity. The Torah, the holy book for Jews, exalted the temple as the preeminent sacred site. The sacred texts instructed Jews from around the world to visit the temple at least 3 times a year: during Passover, during Pentecost, and during the festival of the booths. As the only appropriate site of worship and sacrifice, the temple's utmost importance can hardly be understated. It was the place wherein one solidified their connection to the divine. It was the place wherein heaven and earth met. On any given day, check this out, you could hear the Levites worshiping God. You could see the rabbis teaching from the Torah, and you would witness devout believers seeking to be close to the presence of God. The temple courts were bustling with merchants, with temple goers, and prominent officials. It was the place to be. Historians suggest that during Passover, the most attended religious holiday, the population of Jerusalem nearly tripled in size. Scores of people eagerly descended upon Jerusalem to fulfill their religious obligation. Now central to that obligation, particularly for those who subscribe to Judaism, to the Jewish religion, was worshiping God through sacrificial offering. The literal act of offering up an animal in exchange for the remission of one's sins, in exchange for atonement. The temple was a sacred site. But as you might have ascertained by now, it was not only a sacred site, but it was a secular site. Ostensibly operating as a robust financial institution, the temple profited off of tourism. The driving economic components were both the buying of animals for sacrifice and the exchange of currency. Practitioners of the Jewish faith frequently sent sacrificial offerings to the temple, including precious objects and valuable possessions that were to be housed in the temple. The massive influx of funds gave rise to the temple acting as a state-sponsored bank, levying taxes and requiring non-Judean residents to exchange their currency at a handsome fee. But money changers, those who exchange currency, weren't the only ones who benefited from Jewish pilgrimages to the temple. Merchants, those selling animals for sacrificial offering, increased their wealth and their profits margins thanks to the steady flow of devout believers. Most powerful among the merchants were, check this out, the dove sellers. Doves were, according to the historical record, the most common animal used for sacrifice, thus making them the most profitable. And beloved, this is where we find Jesus. We find Jesus in the temple courts. We find Jesus in the midst of exploitation and marginalization. This is where we find Jesus. He's here bearing witness to money changers and dove-selling merchants, exploiting temple goers through dubious economic practices. This is where we find Jesus, bearing witness to the centering of profit over people. This is where we find Jesus, bearing witness to those who claim proximity to God but bear no fruit. As we meander through the highlighted scripture that I lifted up today, I invite you to wonder where we might find Jesus today. We might find him at the U.S.-Mexico border, bearing witness to the lukewarm response of those fleeing from persecution and poverty. We might find Jesus in federal and state prisons, bearing witness to those wrongfully convicted and those fighting trumped-up charges. We might find Jesus in New York, in San Francisco, and Atlanta, bearing witness to anti-Asian violence. Beloved, we might find Jesus there. And perhaps it's an opportune time for me to offer up a pregnant pause and speak to the othered in this country. As you navigate the ragged edges of life and you taste the shrewd and stale bread of dehumanization, I offer a word of hope. God is there. In the face of unbelievable attacks against your humanity and your agency, I just want to remind you, God is there. In the face of devastating economic calamity caused by a system that makes the rich richer and the poor poorer, God is there. In the face of racist, misogynistic, white supremacist tentacles sprawling across the fabric of American life, I just want to tell you that God is there. And to really underscore this point, I just want to lift up a story for you. There were two fathers raising a child. One father was in the kitchen cooking. Another father was watching the child who was in the crib. The father was watching the child and the child began to cry. He yells to his husband and says, "Hey, babe, the baby is crying. I want to take the baby out of the crib." The husband who's cooking in the kitchen says, "No, leave him in there. We want him to stay comfortable. He'll stop crying eventually." The father was heartbroken and wondered, how in the world can I get around this verdict to not actually take my child out of the crib? He yells to the husband again and says, "The baby is crying and I really want to take him out of the crib." The husband yells from the kitchen, "No, leave him in there." Perplexed, the father says, "You know what? He said I couldn't take you out, but he never said that I couldn't get in there with you. And beloved, I just want to say today, that's who God is. Even when he may not take us out of the calamity, even when he may not take us out of the despair, I can assure you that God is right here with us. So I just want to encourage you that God promised to never leave nor forsake us. God promised to be with us even until the ends of the world. God promised to never leave us alone. And even when he does not take us out of it, he is right there in it with us. God's comforting spirit abides with those who have been othered. It abides with those who have been othered both now and forever. So as I shift our attention back to the particular pericope, we must ask ourselves, why does this divergent and subversive episode in the ministry of Jesus show up 3 times in the gospel? Why is it? What is it that this text in this moment, in this time, is tailored to teach us? Well, I'm a Baptist preacher, so that means I have to give you 3 points that I want to share before Chris comes in and pulls my virtual coattails. Once Jesus witnesses harm and exploitation, the first thing that the text is tailored to teach us is that Jesus disrupts the very system causing oppression. And he does it through the expression of righteous rage. Let me circle back around and say that Jesus disrupts the very system causing oppression by engaging in protest, by engaging in the expression of righteous rage. So, beloved, we must ask ourselves this simple question: where is our rage toward oppressive systems? In the midst of a pandemic disproportionately impacting Black and brown working class Americans, where is our rage? As we hear in the Derek Chauvin trial, children testify of witnessing George Floyd's life taken. Where is our rage? As we hear about the astronomical rates at which folks are being evicted out of their homes in the midst of a pandemic, I ask you, beloved, where is our rage? And I must ask this question as Christians, as children of God, because in some ways, rage is not just a response, but it should be the response. Let me rush to say that righteous rage has many forms. It can come in quiet, still, yet emphatic voices, and it can come in a booming, table-shaking, truth-telling voice. It can show up in the form of peaceful protest, and it can show up in the form of straight-up resistance. I must caution us to refrain from rushing to judgment about whose rage is more acceptable or more Christian, because far too often the right rage, the white rage, the white rage, the right rage is one that can be co-opted by insidious forces. The white rage, the right rage is one that is palatable for a mainstream audience. But that rage, I submit to you today, may not be the rage that Christ demands of us. Perhaps his rage is destabilizing. Perhaps his rage disrupts the status quo. Perhaps his rage is the least respectable of them all. This is hard and maybe even an uncomfortable truth, but sometimes God calls us to work against systems instead of within systems. Sometimes God calls us to dismantle systems instead of to reform systems. So, beloved, I beseech you in the words of Dr. King to not be more concerned and devoted to order than you are to justice. Justice is messy work. It's work that demands an urgent and visceral response to injustice. And here it is. Justice is the work of Christians. If we are to undo Christianity's love affair with hierarchy and power, we need to utilize rage in ways that might even make us uncomfortable. With that said, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, when was the last time you decided to speak out and to speak up against harm and exploitation? How have you leveraged your own finances, your own network, and your own social capital to bring attention to injustice? Put simply, when was the last time you disrupted oppressive systems through the expression of righteous rage? We have to ruminate on this question. We have to wrestle with this question because it is in fact what we have been called to do. So the first thing that we see in the text is that God disrupts oppressive systems. But in addition to disrupting oppressive systems, what we see Jesus do is actually demand accountability and assign culpability. Let me circle back around and say that again. Jesus demands accountability and assigns culpability. I promise I'm not making it up. This is squarely in line with an accurate exegesis, not just a self-guided eisegesis. That might sound familiar to you. Jesus assigning culpability, Jesus demanding accountability. As I mentioned in previous comments, the primary cogs in the wheel of temple profit making, check this out, were money changers and dove selling merchants. In the text, we actually see that when Jesus has this fit of rage, he decides to turn over the table and benches of who? Money changers and dove selling merchants. What are you trying to say, preacher? In other words, Jesus did not disrupt without a diagnosis of the problem and of those who were complicit. Jesus moved beyond critique by symbolically naming those who promulgated exploitative systems. Somebody's probably saying, preacher, okay, what do you want me to learn from this? I'm glad you asked. There is no way we can disrupt and dismantle systems without naming those who are responsible for creating and upholding them. Talk to me, somebody. Without the assignment of culpability, there can be no accountability. That was good. Let me say it again. Without the assignment of culpability, there can be no accountability. Systems do not exist or operate without the support of people and policies. Therefore, it is imperative that we create a more just world, but we can only do that if we have a good sense of who and what is at fault. Let me be clear. I'm not suggesting that we antagonize and demonize. I'm simply suggesting that we name the ideologies and individuals responsible for harm so that we can hold power to account. Too often, truth telling and the act of naming harm is synonymous with castigation, when in fact it is an opportunity for one to reckon with harm caused and to be part of accounting, to be part of reparations. Saints, I mean, it's really this simple. A doctor cannot treat a patient without naming the sickness. An architect cannot build without a proper understanding of the foundation upon which they are building. A therapist cannot create a treatment plan without a proper diagnosis. We cannot begin to dismantle and disrupt systems of oppression unless we have an accurate diagnosis of who and what is at fault. Unless we are willing to name decades worth of systemic, institutional, and interpersonal violence, we will not be able to heal those who have been wounded. I feel like preaching. So, beloved, the discomfort of naming must never supersede our demand for accountability. Let me say that again. Our discomfort with naming must never supersede our demand for accountability. Our kingdom-based strategies for advancing justice must always center those on the margins. Policing our righteous rage is a disservice to the dispossessed. It is an affront to those who have been oppressed. It is an affront to the liberating cause of Christ. And here it is. This might be hard for folks to take in, but I've been called to say it. I've been called to be a truth teller. It is violent. Because after all, silence is in fact violence. Jesus recognized that a path forward could not emerge without a clear diagnosis of the problem, including naming those who are complicit. So what we see is, one, Jesus disrupts systems of oppression. Two, he demands accountability and assigns culpability. But as I hurry to the close, the last thing we see Jesus do is deem the status quo insufficient. Deemed the status quo insufficient. But here it is, he also offered an alternative. He also offered an alternative. Here it is. If I can tell you, Jesus, once he turns over the tables, once he sends everyone out, he says, "It is written, my house shall be called the house of prayer, but you have turned it into a den of robbers." So here it is. Jesus moves from lodging a protest to destroying property to running people out. He then goes on to name those who are complicit and those who are culpable so that he can ensure accountability. But then Jesus decides that the status quo is not sufficient and we must create an alternative path. So Jesus says, my house must be called the house of prayer. Yes, Jesus embodied righteous rage. Yes, Jesus destroyed property. Yes, Jesus named those who were complicit. But Jesus also proposed a new path forward. He says, my house should be called the house of prayer. You know this, there are a lot of Christians on the call. Prayer for Christians can mean many things. But on the most basic level, it is the sacred act of listening to God and of listening to the other. Beloved, do not be so distracted by the ways in which one displays rage or expresses rage that you stop listening. Don't be so ideologically rigid that you stop hearing the heart of the brokenhearted. Don't be so blinded by your privilege and your access that you no longer mourn injustice in our world. Don't be so consumed with order that you do not pursue the messiness of justice-centered work. I was not there when Jesus turned over the tables. I can only read the account just like you, but after seeking God's voice and with much study, I can walk away from this text believing that God has called us to never stop listening. Never stop listening to the cries of indigenous folks. Never stop listening to the cries of Black folks. Never stop listening to the cries of queer folks. Never stop listening to the cries of Asian folks. Never stop listening to the cries of differently abled folks. Never stop listening to the cries of those on the margins. We must always be willing to hear. We must always be willing to learn. We must always be willing to sit with the harm that perhaps we may have caused. Either willingly or unwittingly, we cause harm. So it is imperative that when folks approach us, when folks talk to us, when folks take out the time to invest emotional energy to teach us, we engage in the sacred act of listening. Because what I've learned from this text is that often those who embody righteous rage in civil and uncivil ways often have a vision. But check this out, even though they have a vision, few people stick around to hear it. Righteous rage, I've come to realize, does not indicate the lack of a vision, but the presence of one. That was so good, I want to say it again. Righteous rage does not indicate the lack of a vision, but the presence of it. It conveys an unflinching commitment to reimagine the ways in which we relate to those on the margins. It comes from an unquenchable sense of urgency born out of our deep discomfort with injustice and wrongdoing. Therefore, we must always hold space for uncompromised, undignified, uncivilized disruption. We must always leave room for uncivilized, uncompromised, undignified, righteous rage, because it is the pathway by which we access a more expansive worldview. It is the pathway by which we imagine a new world. So, beloved, I pray that your righteous rage never dies. I pray that it burns slow and that it burns long. I pray that it spreads and infects those around you. I pray that it rages on in solidarity with those of us who have been othered. I pray that for folks like me who are Black, who are queer, you actually take the time to listen. I pray that you never stop standing in solidarity with those who have been othered. I say this with conviction because the premise of our faith and the focus of this Good Friday is on a man who was othered. That man is Jesus himself. He was a brown man who grew up in the hood of Nazareth. His hood was so much of a hood that many wondered whether anything good could come out of Nazareth. He spent time with the left out, the left behind, and the lonely. He was falsely accused and wrongly convicted. Does it sound familiar? Elites rejected him, the educated belittled him, and the powerful despised him. He was lynched on a tree. Jesus himself was othered. But thanks be unto God, Jesus showed us that those who are othered can be victorious. So to the othered, I say to you, keep on keeping on. Because in the face of unbelievable opposition, God would empower you to withstand. Because when God is for you, he is more than those who are against you. So I've taken too much of your Friday evening. So I want to leave you with these words. You can find them in Micah 6:8. Do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly before your God. Because if you faint not, you will be rewarded by God's riches in heaven. Embody righteous rage. Do it in an undignified, uncivilized way. And when you do that, God will be standing with you. God will be fighting with you. God will be empowering you to speak truth to power. The type of truth that is earth-shaking. The type of truth that is table-shaking. The type of truth that brings systems of oppression down to its very knees. And be encouraged, because even if you only disrupt systems of oppression for a moment, you could save a life. Even if you disrupt systems of oppression for a moment, you can advance justice. Even if you only disrupt systems of oppression for a slight second, we can move one step closer to heaven on earth. God bless you, and thank you so much for the privilege and the opportunity to share with you. Chris, I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you so much, Don. Wow, I'm not great at reacting or processing really quickly in the moment. I'm very moved right now and just thinking through the things that you said. What a convicting, powerful word. One thing that just stands out to me, especially for so many of us are drawn to religion, to Christianity, because of stability, or a desire for a sense of, like order and things coming together. And religion provides that, right? Like Christianity, especially, so that like often the center, I think, for us is the thing that we are building, right? That like we're building this thing that becomes a source of strength to us. And then we don't want to hear other voices, or we don't want to hear things that might challenge us. And obviously I speak this, this is especially true like in like white church spaces, but I think there's something true about it in general as we build religious institutions. And what you've done, at least for me right now, is you're reminding me like where the center of the faith is, and it is not a center that is trying to build new human institutions that must be defended. It is a center that is calling us to constantly question ourselves and to question systemic injustices and the structures in conjunction with and on behalf of and listening to the marginalized voices around us. And so I'm just really moved by that, and it's really making me think a lot about what it means to be a leader of a Christian institution, but also what does it mean for our daily lives in faith? How do we, like, what is the center of our Christian lives? That's what I'm chewing on right now. I think there's probably 1,000 reactions to what you said, and I want to give everyone a chance to interact with what Don has said. So we're going to have a moment to we'll have a response song, and during that time we can treat that as a moment to gather our thoughts and engage with God and center ourselves and receive the word, let it process. And during that song, if you have questions for Don, I want to invite you to post them in the chat like we've done the last few weeks. And then when the song is over, we'll come back on and we'll bring Don back out here, and he'll interact with some of the questions or thoughts that you have and that you want to share. The song is provided for us, recorded by Grace Wang, who graduated in 2019. And she, some of you know her and love her. She was a big part of CCF for those of us who overlapped with her in her time here. And she took time out of her busy life as a working woman to, in the evening, to make this song for us. So we're going to let her lead us into this response together, and then we'll come back with some questions for Don.
open up my eyes in wonder and show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me.
All right. I'm going to bring Dawn back on here. Hey, Dawn.
Hey.
Good to see you. Thank you so much for that that word you brought. I love the preparation and thought that goes into it and the passion. And really came through tonight. You know, you've won over fans from people who aren't part of CCF. I have family members who are excited to tune into the broadcast tonight. So, and you do not disappoint. Wanted a chance to talk with you about a couple of things. I'm going to bring up a question here that Lorraine was asking, so I'll post it on here. She says, rage can be tiring. How can you sustain it without it consuming you?
That's actually really, really good. I think the answer to that question is really rooted in community. Ultimately, right? While the text that I preached today centered Jesus in the temple, enraged, frustrated with what he witnessed, Jesus always came back to community, right? But not only came back to community, but came back to himself. There are many times where we see in scripture, Jesus just goes off alone, into the wilderness, praying, communing with God. And I think the answer is there, right? It is ensuring that as you're experiencing that rage, you are also rooting yourself in community, but you're also rooting yourself in communion with God. That can be really life-giving and energizing, because when you're around folks who understand your experience, when you're around folks who are allies who do the work, right, you're able to actually let your guard down. Right? You're able to laugh and experience joy and not really be bogged down in the weight of having to explain your existence or to explain your experience. So I think that's the answer that I would give. The answer to it is, I think, by being in community and staying in communion with God and leaning into the things that give you joy.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I think that's something a lot of people struggle with. One question that I have for you is, what do we do about the fact that we may feel more rage about some things than others? So I know for many of us, if an issue hits home, there's no need to bring it up. It's there, right? It's like, this affects my people, or this affects someone that I care about, or this is an issue that I've studied, and when I see this happening again, it just fires me up. But then there's other things that kind of catch us by surprise. Something happens and we forget to notice that it's a big deal until we begin to see, wow, this is actually making a lot of news. So I'm wondering, as someone who has been in a number of activist spaces and thinking about these things, how do you navigate that question of where your empathy naturally drives you to rage versus where you're blind to it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, I think what it boils down to for me is recognizing, and it goes back to what I preached, like recognizing that a part of my faith is a consistent commitment to listen to the perceived other, right? Like my faith not only suggests, but demands, right? Compels me to constantly be thinking about and listening to those on the margins. And that doesn't mean you have to go out and create friendships with all these different people who are suffering, right? That simply means that you need to be reading about these experiences. You need to be taking classes about experiences that exist outside of your own. You have to cultivate a hunger within yourself to recognize that justice is intersectional. Our humanity is tied up and bound up in one another. And in order for us to actually be free, right? In order for me, a Black queer man, to be free, that does not mean, like, that means that I cannot be free if my sister isn't free. I cannot be free if my trans brother is not be free. I cannot be free if my Asian friends are not free, right? Like, I have to see that these things are intimately connected with one another. And if you advance one without the other, there's a real possibility that not only are you replicating harm, but you are not sufficiently dismantling these ideologies because they are interconnected with one another. So I'd say stay committed to learning and to listening, and go out of your way, right? Even when you think you are doing enough, go out of your way to hear and listen to those who are experiencing oppression in ways that you don't have experience in. And the one caveat there is, you also want to make sure that you aren't burdening folks, right, to share their experiences. I always like to say there are literally people who get paid to write about this. They're called professors. And you can read their books and read their writings and listen to their lectures, and they are more than happy to theorize with you about it and provide some historical context. Don't always lay that burden at the feet of those who are in the midst of processing their own trauma.
Right. One of the commenters, Joseph, mentions about the concern of fetishizing people. Fetishizing people because they're different, and I can imagine an extension of that. Like, it's like, wow, now I have to go find an indigenous friend. Now I have to go find, and like, they don't need that kind of friendship, right? Like,
No.
Yeah, that makes sense. One other thing that I've been thinking about as you're talking, and again, I'm really processing this from the place of like what it means to be a Christian community, in our case, CCF, that has leadership, and that like how we avoid replicating and falling into that love affair with power, because so much of it is benign, right? Like we end up doing it, and like you said, we cause harm, and we don't even realize we're doing it, or maybe we mean well. And so do you have a sense of like what it looks like to create organizations? I take it as a given. I know not everyone does. I take it as a given that almost every organization is going to have leadership, that there's going to be at least a certain amount of like a dynamic there. Most people in a new organization would rather have someone else leading it and they can be part. And so how do we have organizations like that, but that then don't fall into the traps of becoming like their own self-replicating thing that produces harm? Is there a just way to do that, or are organizations themselves the problem?
I great question. And my immediate response is that's the conundrum of sin. right. Like the Bible says we are literally born in sin and shapen in iniquity. That means that it literally exists all around of us. It pervades everything that we do. So what that means is, if that's our starting place, we need to be constantly thinking about how we might undercut and subvert the inertia behind those sinful ideologies, right? Those white supremacist, anti-Asian, misogynistic, patriarchal ideologies that I describe as sin, right? So in order for us to actually build an organization that works against that, we need to first ask ourselves, how do we center the voices and experiences of those who we purport to want to minister to, right? How do we center the voices and experience of those whom we purport to want to serve? I think often organizations fall into the trap of, whether it's the nonprofit industrial complex or the Christian church planting industrial complex, whatever that may be, we fall into this trap of engaging in this sort of white savior mentality, engaging in this sort of appeasing and appealing to funders and power brokers, instead of actually asking the folks whom we want to be in relationship with, what is most effective for you? right? And I think more often than not, when we are led by that voice, we will actually work toward being an institution, right, that does not replicate the same harm. But you have to stay connected to those voices. You have to stay connected and rooted to the ground. And what that means is you're going to have to balance some competing priorities. And more often than not, you'll know you're doing the right thing, likely when you've pissed off people in power. Right? I think that's a good gauge of the fact that you're actually standing with and alongside community.
That's a great point. I was thinking about that earlier, how you know well, like our story, and that we were part of a national Christian organization and very much loved being part of it. And as long as we were in alignment with them, and then when we began to ask questions about, wait, do we believe the right thing about queerness, right, and queer people, and challenging the traditional perspective that we had on that, I always think about it as like, the wood feels smooth when you're going with the grain, and then as soon as you go against it, then you start getting all these splinters, right?
Yes,
and
yes.
Surprise, right? We ended up booted out of that organization pretty fast after we started questioning that. But it does raise that question of how do you make sure, right, you don't then turn around and replicate it in some other way. And I appreciate your word about who's being centered, and a focus on keeping that center where it should be. And then at some point, some institutions, like maybe we have to remind ourselves to do that. And sometimes we just have to burn it down and start over because it's become too much thing, right?
Yes. And I think that's what Jesus did in many ways in the temple. They literally had to start all over again. And they started over with the thought and idea that, oh, this could happen again. Right? Sometimes it's the threat of that, right? That we need to burn this down so that other folks can recognize that if we continue in the same way, there's a threat of us being called out and in some ways challenged. So do it proactively. Don't wait until you're called out on it.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Don. Oh, wait, you know what? There's we're a little over 7, but I see another question showed up, and I want to. Okay. This will be our last question. This is from Jeremy. He writes, where have you found inspiration for cultivating intersectional community? How might we remain connected through or after Righteous Rage?
I so appreciate that. Honestly, it hasn't been a particular place, right, where I've been able to sort of find that community. But over the years, I've just been in relationships with folks who may not share the same identity, but share my heart. Right. And that's how I've been able to really build up my own praxis of intersectional work. But if I'm being honest with you, a lot of it came also through just individual work, right? Me reading, me listening to preachers from different backgrounds and perspectives, me watching different things, right? Me educating myself, right? And recognizing that if I really want to be effective and if I'm really trying to bring about justice, it means that I have to incorporate these experiences into a way that I understand justice if I really want to bring justice to the forefront. And in terms of maintaining it through and with community, the thing I'll say there is it's a matter of sort of gauging capacity. I don't know if I'm, interpreting this correctly, but, there are some times where, I'm not interested in having conversations with my white friends, like I appreciate them, but right now what I need, right, is to actually be in conversation with folks I don't have to explain myself to, be in conversation with folks who recognize and understand the trauma that they see on my face and in my body, right? So sometimes you don't need to be in relationship with people as you are battling your rage, right? Sometimes you don't actually need to be around folks who, in some ways, you can actually point to as the source of your rage. I think that's the sort of one-on-one thing, or I guess one-on-one basis. But, perhaps you don't need to be in relationship with folks as you're processing that and, dealing with it.
It's a good word. It's a good word. And it speaks to how I think so many of us are experiencing like the need for multiple community spaces.
Yes.
That just that one church probably isn't going to do it, right? Or or just your family or whatever. That there's a real benefit to being connected to people in different places and ways.
Couldn't agree with you more. Well,
thank you so much, Don. Really appreciate the time you've given us, and we've loved having you. We're going to hand it back to Paris right now to close out the meeting. So we'll see you later, Don.
All right.
And then Paris, are you there? I'm going to bring you on. All right, I see you.
Wait a minute. Okay, now we're good. Now we're on in here. Wow. Thank you, Don, again. The whole time I was like, come on, Don. Come on. You better preach, Don. Come on now. So that was definitely really, really, really good talk this evening. I have a lot to reflect on about righteous rage, because I'm like, you know what? Sometimes I just, you get age with everything going on in this world. But but thankfully we have God with us, right? Right. Come on now. I just feel it in my spirit. But anyways, and definitely, I hope that you enjoyed this evening's talk as much as I did. And again, come say hi in our after fellowship hangout. Find the Zoom link on Facebook and Lorraine's weekly emails. You all have a great rest of your evening and a great weekend, and a great Easter weekend, Resurrection Sunday. Yes, all that.